Most people think the Federal Reserve's job is simple. Cut rates when the economy hurts, raise rates when inflation hurts, stand in the middle, act serious, and pretend the machine is still manageable. I have never believed it was that simple, not anymore. Because the Federal Reserve is no longer standing in front of one problem. It is standing between three fires. That is the line I want you to keep in your mind while I talk to you. Three fires, not one. The first fire is inflation. The second fire is economic weakness. The third fire is the interest cost of the debt itself. That third fire is the one almost nobody outside serious money talks about honestly. And it is exactly why this moment matters so much. Because once the central bank must think not only but also about what happens when the cost of funding the government starts swallowing the government's own breathing room. You are no longer in ordinary monetary policy. You are in regime change. That is the mother line for this whole story. Regime change. Not because the Fed said something theatrical, because the pressures under the system are no longer the old pressures. For years, the public was told a neat story. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate: employment and inflation. Keep labor healthy, keep prices stable, adjust rates, guide expectations, repeat. That story was always incomplete, but it was useful because it sounded orderly. It gave ordinary people the feeling that someone competent was still holding the wheel. Now the dashboard is telling a very different truth. Inflation is still not fully dead. The economy is not clearly strong. Oil is rising hard enough to threaten prices across the entire system. And meanwhile, the national debt is so large that the interest alone has started behaving like a separate national crisis. That is why this Fed decision matters more than people think. Not because rates were held, because the hold exposed the trap. If they cut too soon, they risk feeding inflation again. If they raise, they risk choking the economy harder. If they hold, the debt service meter keeps spinning while everyone pretends the delay itself is a strategy. That is the box. And once a central bank is boxed in, every decision becomes more political whether they admit it or not. Now let us start with the surface event that people saw. No rate cuts, no rate hikes. Just a hold to most people. That sounds boring. It is not boring. It is paralysis wrapped in formal language. The official explanation is uncertainty. Fine, I believe that part. The Fed does not know exactly where the economy is moving because the economy itself is now being pulled in opposite directions. On one side, higher energy costs threaten to reheat inflation and keep essentials expensive. On the other side, companies are nervous. Hiring is softer, and parts of the economy already feel like they are carrying much more weight than the headline numbers admit. That is why the vote matters too. A deeply divided Federal Reserve is not just a procedural curiosity. It is a symptom. It tells you that the institution itself no longer has a clean dominant theory of what problem deserves priority. Some members want higher rates to defend the currency and restrain inflation. Others want lower rates to keep the economy from weakening further. This is not healthy consensus. It is an elite argument about which pain should be chosen first. That is what makes the moment dangerous. Not because the Fed is ignorant, because the constraints are real. Now let me tell you where the deeper problem sits. The debt America owes so much money now that the interest itself has become a kind of hidden tax system. When a government owes over $39 trillion and is paying more than $1 trillion a year in interest, the conversation changes. You are no longer simply debating stimulus versus restraint. You are debating how long a debtor empire can keep paying rent on its own excess without either weakening the currency, squeezing the economy, or finding some new buyer desperate enough to keep financing the structure. That is the net interest trigger. And once you see it, you realize why the next Fed chair matters so much. The old Fed story says the institution fights inflation and supports labor. The new Fed problem says the institution may soon be forced to care just as much about the sustainability of debt financing itself. That is a much uglier job, because it means monetary policy is no longer merely about managing cycles. It is about managing the consequences of a fiscal addiction so large that ordinary rate levels now feel dangerous. That is why I do not like simple commentary on rate cuts anymore. People say, just cut and help the economy. Fine, and then what? Mortgage rates may fall some. Borrowing becomes cheaper. Housing demand reawakens. Asset prices may inflate again. Spending picks up. And inflation, which was never fully dead, gets another shot of oxygen. That is one side. Then the other side says, raise rates again, fight inflation. Fine, and then what? Housing gets weaker, borrowing gets tighter. Business investment slows, labor softens further, and the government's own debt service costs become even harder to stomach. That is the other side. Neither side is wrong. That is what makes this moment so poisonous. The system is overburdened enough that almost every medicine now harms something important. This is why oil matters so much. People still underestimate oil. They think of it as a gasoline story. It is not. Oil bleeds into shipping, trucking, agriculture, fertilizers, plastics, packaging, freight, aviation, manufacturing, and all the hidden pathways through which ordinary life becomes more expensive. So when oil rises fast enough, inflation is not merely a statistic. It becomes a cost wave touching almost every layer of the economy. That is why the Fed cannot simply ignore it. You can hold rates steady and speak calmly at a podium. But if energy keeps forcing costs higher through the real economy, then your hold is not peace. It is delay. That is all. And delay is useful only if the system can survive the waiting. Now let us talk about the personnel piece, because this is where many people start overreacting. Jerome Powell stepping down as chair, but not leaving the board, changes the internal chemistry of the Fed more than the headlines suggest. Why? Because influence does not vanish just because the title changes. If he remains in the room, remains a vote, remains a voice, then the incoming chair does not simply inherit an empty stage. He inherits a divided institution with lingering power centers and an argument already in progress. That matters because the public was hoping the new chair would produce a cleaner pivot, maybe lower rates, maybe a different tone, maybe a fresh start. But the reality is messier. A new chair cannot erase the debt math. He cannot erase oil. He cannot erase inflation psychology. He cannot erase the fact that every market in the world now watches Treasury yields as the foundation beneath almost every other price. That is why I prefer to think about the next chair not as a savior, but as a different negotiator with the same prison walls. Kevin Warsh's basic vision, at least as described in the source material, is fascinating because it tries to solve an impossible equation. Cut rates, shrink the balance sheet, keep inflation from flaring, avoid pushing long-term yields higher. That is a beautiful plan on paper. Paper is forgiving. Reality is not. The logic sounds elegant enough. Lower short-term rates to ease pressure on borrowers and the economy. At the same time, reduce the Fed's balance sheet, so money is pulled out of the system and inflation does not reaccelerate. Very clever, almost surgical. But the moment you push on the details, the real question appears: who replaces the buyer? That is the sentence. Because when the Federal Reserve stops being a meaningful holder of treasuries and begins reducing its presence, someone else must absorb that paper. If the supply of government debt remains enormous and the central bank steps back, then either private demand rises enough to fill the gap, or yields must rise to attract the necessary buyers. This is not ideology, it is auction math. And once you understand that, you see why treasuries matter so much beyond government finance. Treasury yields sit under nearly everything. Mortgage pricing, corporate borrowing, consumer credit, business lending, asset valuations, risk premiums, the so-called risk-free rate is not a sideshow. It is the ruler the rest of the financial world uses to measure value. That is why I always tell people, the treasury market is not boring. It is the spinal cord. If treasury yields rise because the market demands more compensation to absorb U.S. debt, then borrowing gets more expensive all through the system. A mortgage lender does not price your house loan in a vacuum. A bank looks at what it can earn lending to the government and then demands more from you because you are riskier than the government. That is how the ladder works. So if the government must pay more, you usually pay more too. That is why a balance sheet shrink sounds tidy and powerful until you remember the scale of the debt behind it. The private sector may absorb some of it. Foreign buyers may absorb some of it. Institutions may absorb some of it. But the confidence that all of it will be absorbed without yields rising meaningfully is the kind of confidence I do not grant casually. Now I want to say something about inflation definitions, because this is where trust quietly dies. Whenever a system is under pressure, one temptation always appears. Change the measuring stick. Do not fix the heat. Redefine what counts as hot. This is why any talk of redefining inflation should make a serious person pay attention immediately. Maybe the current definitions are imperfect. Fine, they always were. But when a heavily indebted system starts reconsidering how it officially measures price pressure, I do not celebrate flexibility. I become suspicious of incentives. Because if the public feels inflation at one level and the official measure says something gentler, then policy begins resting on a softer story than lived reality supports. That is dangerous. Not because statistics are lies in some childish absolute sense, because a system can hide a great deal inside category changes, substitution logic, housing methodology, and the choice of what pain to count more heavily. Ordinary people do not live inside formulas. They live inside bills, rent, insurance, groceries, property taxes, travel, fuel, repairs, education, health care. If those keep rising faster than wages and savings, then the public experiences inflation whether the formula chooses to flatter them or not. That is what matters. Now let us talk about what this means for your paycheck, because that is the real bridge from macro theory into ordinary life. When money is printed too aggressively, the value of each unit falls. That is not some mystical law, it is dilution. If more units chase the same real goods and services, then your paycheck buys less unless it rises fast enough to compensate. Most people know this in their bones already. They feel poorer. Even if the headline economy looks decent enough on television, their paycheck comes in, the bills go out, the food, the rent, the insurance, the repairs, the housing costs, the small humiliations of everyday life all feel heavier than they used to. That is because nominal income and real purchasing power are not the same thing. And this is why I keep returning to the same question. What is the Fed really trying to save now? The dollar, the labor market, asset prices, the debt market. The answer is that it can no longer serve one master cleanly. That is the real break from the old regime. Now, this does not mean collapse tomorrow. I do not deal in theatrical endings. It means the game has become more conflicted. And conflicted systems often drift toward the same type of solution over time. Financial repression, not loud default, not sudden national bankruptcy, slow pressure, higher prices tolerated a little longer than they should be. Savers undercompensated, debt quietly made easier in real terms. The system kept liquid enough that the visible crisis never fully appears while the hidden transfer keeps happening. That is what prudent people should be watching for. Not some dramatic explosion, a long erosion. And that is why the transition at the Fed matters so much. Not because one man will suddenly fix it, because the institution is being forced to admit, through its own division, that the old playbook no longer solves all three fires at once: inflation, the economy, debt service. Pick one pain to reduce, and another tends to worsen. That is the structure. So what do I do with a structure like this? First, I stop pretending cash is neutral. Cash is necessary, of course it is. You need liquidity, you need safety, you need operating money, but large passive cash positions in a system biased toward dilution are not prudence. They are exposure. Second, I respect real assets and productive ownership more than nominal promises. Good businesses with pricing power, broad equities when bought with discipline, selected real estate where the terms are sane, some hard asset hedges where appropriate. Anything tied to real-world repricing tends to behave better in a system that solves its debt stress through weaker money and tolerated inflation. Third, I pay attention to long-term rates, not just the headline Fed rate. If Treasury yields are the actual hinge under mortgages, borrowing, and valuation, then that is where the real signal often sits. Not the press conference theater, the bond market. Fourth, I stop treating central bank language as a clean promise and start treating it as negotiation language spoken inside a trapped system. That is a much healthier posture. And finally, I remember the one thing most people always forget. At moments like this, the system does not need to look dramatic to become expensive. A paycheck can shrink in real value quietly. A savings account can lose ground quietly. A mortgage rate can stay painfully high quietly. A tax burden can become more punitive quietly. The public notices late because late is when pain becomes undeniable. Markets notice earlier because markets are paid to anticipate who must eventually flinch. That is why the Fed's strange decision matters, not because it solved anything, because it revealed the fight. And once the fight is visible, the careful investor stops asking, "What did they decide this meeting?" He asks the better question: what kind of world forces a central bank to hold still because every direction now risks breaking something important? That is the world we are entering. And in that world, the investor who thinks only in yesterday's terms is going to find himself poorer in real terms, even if every official headline keeps trying to reassure him that the machine is under control. It is not under control. It is under strain. There is a difference. And strain always shows up in your wallet before it fully shows up in the official story.